Here on behalf of the Hamilton College Jazz Archives Project on the Royal Caribbean Cruise, and we're talking with Derek Smith, a well-traveled piano player who is performing this evening, and we're here to get his thoughts on the state of jazz and his experiences in the jazz world. So welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, I'm well-traveled. That's not usually used. I'm usually described as a pianist of ill repute.
I think that's in the Grove Dictionary of Jazz, as a matter of fact.
Well-traveled, I
Yeah.
like that. That's very nice.
It's interesting to talk. We have talked with, I think, one other person who came from England, Gillian Williams, actually, and we were getting her take on how jazz was kind of spread from America to other parts, and wondered if you can tell us how it came to be that you became a jazz musician. And
Well, it was disseminated through records, of course. And when I was a kid, you couldn't buy American records. For some, I never understand to this day why, but they weren't allowed. The government after the war distrusted everybody, I think, and
no kidding.
And American records were not allowed in. But somehow I got to hear a record by Art Tatum. It's an absolute classic, T for Two. And up to then, I'd just been listening to everybody and imitating anybody, any piano player. I mean, I didn't know the difference between a classical piano and a jazz piano player. I just tried to play anything, you know. I'd listen all day to the radio, and then run into where the piano was, and kind of woodshed all this stuff. And then one day I heard this Art Tatum thing, and it was like suddenly getting a focus. I thought, oh, if I could play like that, you know.
Did you take classical?
I spent the last 50 years trying, never succeeded, but yes, of course I did.
Yeah.
But you have to understand that the war was still on then, and I was the same kind of kid as everybody. I didn't really want to practice, even though I knew I had some talent even then. But luckily, my mother and father managed to send me to some different ladies, local ladies. The first one taught me to read and play scales, which I thank God for that she did that. The next one got me onto the Bach inventions. And the third one got me onto early Chopin, and believe me, I was so lucky that these people were there. Because if you can still play some of those Chopin etudes, you're a pretty good piano player.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. But later on, the American records managed to be in England. They were pirated in. They appeared somehow, even though it was against the law. And of course, all the guys with talent or who like this kind of music managed to get them, and we all managed to hear these records. And so it was an imitative process. And even by the time I left, I was 25 when I left. It was still the same thing. The records were coming in just in a dribble sense, so you didn't really get the whole spectrum. And at that time I thought, well, it's pointless me staying around London because it's all kind of imitative, and if I really want to test myself, I've got to go to New York or one of the centers of jazz. So that's what we did, and we never looked back.
Oh, that's a big step.
Well, at that age, you don't realize how big it is, you know. And now looking back,
wow,
I would never have done that, I suppose.
Did you have any connections when you first came
here? Not a soul.
Wow.
No, luckily my wife and I were getting married, and we thought, we'll try. We can always come back.
Yeah.
How did you get started in New York? How did you survive
well,
like the first 3 months they say is the
I mean, you really want a story? You can edit all this. First of all, you know, I come to New York not knowing a soul, but I found out where the Musicians Union was, and you got to remember that when I was in England, they talked about American Musicians Union as being so powerful, and that, you know, that's great union, and they'll take care of it. So I went straight down there, and the guy heard my English accent. He said, "You from England?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You can't join." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There's a feud between the two unions, the English union and the American unions. Over there, they won't allow American musicians to join, so you can't join." And he put the thing down in my face. I said, "How do I make a living?" He said, "That's your problem." So, but he did say, "You can come back in 6 months. If you prove that you've been in New York for 6 months, then you can join." So I got a job in insurance.
I read that you sold insurance.
No, I didn't sell insurance. I showed up every day at an office. And luckily I didn't do too much damage. I didn't ruin the company, but I really had very little aptitude for it. I looked kind of busy and went through the motions. But 6 months to the day, I left and went back to the Union, and that's another story. Same guy was there. He said, "You again?" So I said, "Yes," and now, you know, I really need it. So he said, "Well, you've got to take an audition." I said, "Fine," you know, I've been practicing. So he said, "Go in there," and I had to follow the lady in. There was a lady, and she was taking the audition on maracas. You believe this? But she was a singer, but she wanted to join the musicians union, so she had.
She was
took
auditioning on
Right, on
maracas.
maracas. So he said, "Next."
Am I correct in saying the singers have to be in an actors guild or something like that?
No, they've got a separate union now,
Okay.
which is I forget what it is because it really doesn't concern me. But at that time, they had to be in the musicians union. Otherwise, they couldn't work because it was very strongly unionized. So anyway, he says, "Next." So I go into this room. There's the piano, and he says, "What's that instrument over there?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Piano." He said, "You're in. Go upstairs and pay $100. I said, "What?" So I went to the piano and I started roaring. He said, "That's very nice. Go upstairs." And pay."
Oh, man. Kind of what makes you wonder about the level of musicianship that they might have in the union. Huh?
I mean, I'm all for auditions, but they should be serious.
Yeah, you're going to do it.
And they made you wait 6 months for that.
Well, that was a thing to protect. You know, it's unionism, I think, at its worst. It was there to protect the jobs of people who were there. They didn't want too many new people coming and taking their jobs away. Not that I was about to take anybody's job, but I just wanted to be a part of the scene.
Who'd you first start working with?
Oh, well, all right, that's another story. This is, I've been in the country 2 weeks, no, a week. And my wife and I, we'd run out of money because we stayed in a hotel in New York, so we can't live here, it's too much money. So we found an apartment in Brooklyn, and I looked in the local paper, and I saw there was a concert by the Modern Jazz Quartet at Brooklyn Academy of Music. So I said, I gotta say, I love those guys. You know, I'd managed to hear some kind of record. And so I got there very early. And there was John Lewis, you know, the leader, and he's putting programs on every seat. You know, John took care of everything. He wrote the music, made the guys rehearse, and he did everything. And I don't know why, I'm usually a kind of reserved guy, but I started getting into a conversation. And he said, "Oh, I know you." I said, "How could you possibly know me?" He said, "Well, I subscribe to this English periodical, it's called The Gramophone, and they review jazz records. And you made a record in England, and I have it." I said, "What?" And I couldn't believe it. He said, "By the way, what are you doing tomorrow night?" I mean, believe me, I don't make up these stories. It's stranger than fiction. I said, "What do you mean? I'm doing nothing." He said, "Please be at Atlantic Recording Studios, and we'll record something." So I've been 2 weeks, and I made my first record. Wow, and it was with Percy Heath and Connie Kay, not a bad rhythm section. But of course, I was so damn nervous that you know, I've got the record at home. It's not really very good.
Well, what was the role with? I mean, you were both piano players, so what was he having?
He was making it came out. The album was called Jazz Piano International. So he got me, and I was representing England, and he got a French pianist by the name of René Autrega, and we all played like 4 tracks. Wow. And Dick Katz was the American piano player, and that's how the album came out.
You know, there's been so many stories about these kinds of things where people, Al Gray, who happened to be in a club when the Basie band was there, and their trombone player was sick, and the guy said, "Get your horn," and he ran, and it's just amazing little coincidences that help.
Well, those things work, and I mean, that's, you know, time goes by now. Now I'm starting to get a footing. People say, "Hey, the kid can play. He speaks kind of weird, but he can play, so we'll hire him." And now that's how I got into the studio business. You know what I mean by the studio? Playing jingles and record days and things like that. There was a big band, a jingle going on, I forget what it was, for what product, but Hank Jones was supposed to be there, and for some reason Hank was sick or something, and didn't tell him, and he didn't show up. Oh. And there was I downstairs in the bar, just hanging out, and they said, "Oh, the kid's down there, get that English kid." And I came in, and I was you know, full of it, and I played my ass off, and they said, "Okay, great. The kid's fine," and I never looked back. You know,
well, that's
I got in on Hank's coattails.
Yeah, that's where that reading too comes in important.
Yeah.
You know, because you can't just walk into the studio.
No, well, that's where your background comes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've
right.
if you've gone to the academy, and there's no shortcut to reading. You just do it.
Yeah.
You just do it, and there's no shortcut. But the point is, when you're at that stage, when everything is new, read anything. I always tell kids to do that. Read anything. It doesn't matter what it is. Read saxophone parts. Read anything. Just so that it becomes second nature to you.
Yeah.
It's like breathing.
They have a saying at some of the bigger music schools like North Texas State. They say, you got to be able to read fly crap.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The reason why I say that is because, you know, a lot of jazz manuscripts are just scribbled there in pencil, and the stuff is
Right.
faded, and you're reading it in a nightclub where there's barely any light and there's
Right.
smoke all in your eyes,
Right.
you know. So you got to be able to read anything.
Yes. I remember being down there. Well, now I'm a kind of, I'm a veteran. I'm a seasoned veteran, you know. So now they hire me at North Texas State to come down and lecture the kids about, because they're the senior class. They're all 22. They play wonderfully. They play wonderfully because they've got no experience of the outside world at all. So first of all, I said, this wonderful music you've been playing, forget that. This is the real world when you get out there, and you've got to know some songs. So I'm telling a lot of songs that you should know. And, you know, don't come in dressed the way you're dressed, because you'll never get hired again.
Wow. Yeah.
But that's a good school, and the orchestras there are wonderful.
Have you had occasion to play with the Basie band?
Look, the only time I played with a Basie band, and that's cheating, really. It was I was accompanying Sammy Kahn, who was a songwriter of some repute, and Sam would do an act and get a lot of money for playing this act in various parts of the country. So one day Sam calls and says, "Oh, we got this gig in Chicago." So I said, "Fine." He says, "It's with the Basie band." I said, "What?" And he hung up the phone. So we had some arrangements, and I just put them out, and you know, I had to get Count off the piano, raise the piano seat because he had it very low. And we went on, it was the Basie band, and we played all this stuff for Sam, who really wasn't a very good singer, but he wrote all these songs, and so people had to take him seriously. But that was the time with the Basie band. But of course, all the sidemen have been my friends for years, because Frank Foster and Frank West were all in the studios together playing all these dog food commercials for years.
Most of those guys that did that, that was after they had the Basie experience, and the big band road thing, right? And they decided that they wanted to stay in one place for a little while.
Yes, exactly, and that's what they did. And at that time, you have to realize there was so much work for musicians, and especially if you came out of the big band background, because most of the music was kind of jazz influenced, and there was always big budgets for commercials, and they wanted the band to sound right. And so all these guys were coming off the bands and moving straight into this highly paid studio work. And but then, of course, nothing stays the same forever, and the studio work disappears now because of many different reasons. A, that we all got older. B, technology put us out of work because they can do things with synthesizers that they don't need so many live musicians anymore. And so then I read that Frank Foster's back on the road now, leading the band.
Yeah.
So things came full circle.
Full circle.
We had a nice interview with him a couple months ago, and Bill Hughes. Tell us about working with Benny Goodman.
Well, what do you want to know? I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, without a doubt, Benny was the finest jazz clarinetist, or anyway, look, this is all subjective opinion. It's certainly my opinion. I've never heard of anybody that played as well as he did. It thrilled me as well. But given all that, which is a big given, he was a very difficult guy to get along with. None of us really knew why. Either he heard, they say that symphony conductors hear what they want to hear of a piece a fraction of a second before the orchestra plays it, and then if the orchestra doesn't play it exactly the way they hear it in their heads, then they get upset. And I think it was something like that with Benny. He heard exactly what he thought it was going to be. And then if the band wasn't exactly the same, then he would get upset, he would start pointing at people. But anyway, it all doesn't matter. Benny's been dead some years now, and all the music, is so many records of it out, and it'll live forever. It's wonderful music. But the first time I went with him, it was in 1962. I hadn't been in the country that long, and I needed the job, simply to be associated with somebody of that stature. So my friend, he's dead now, the drummer, Mousy Alexander, was a good friend of mine. He said, I'll get you on with Benny. So made all the rehearsals and read the Stealing Apples, you know, the things.
Yeah.
Read all that. Lovely. But I just kept my nose clean, didn't say anything. But then the night, we were going to go to South America the next day. That was the tour. And so 7:30 the night before we were supposed to go, the manager called me up. He said, listen carefully. Benny's going to call in 5 minutes and he's going to fire you. I said, what? What have I done? I haven't said anything. I haven't done anything bad. He said, no, but he's going to fire you. But here's what you say. You say, well, it's all right, Benny, you can fire me, but you know, for the period of 3 weeks that we're going to be away, I've turned down a lot of work, so I feel you've got to pay me the money that you promised me.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, then he'll hire you again. So 5 minutes later, the phone rings. He said, well, look, Pops, it's not working out. You better forget it. So I said, well, okay, Mr. Good. I said, okay, I understand, but I've turned down all this work, and I feel you should pay me for it. And so there's a pause, and he said, okay, you better come with us. I mean, that's exactly how it happened.
Wow.
But then you know, in years later, I got, you know, I was getting successful. Then I was in the NBC band with Doug Severinsen, and then
Right.
as soon as I finished the Tonight Show at 7, I'd run upstairs and play with Benny Goodman at the Rainbow Girls, all in the same building. You know, I mean, I was working like night and day.
Yeah.
And I got very close to Benny then, and that was an equal mistake. He would call me up and say, well, what do you think of so and so? What do you think of so and so? Before they hired him.
Yeah.
And then the axe fell, as it does with everybody. I think it was 1973 or something. I was still on staff at NBC doing the Tonight Show every day, and but Benny called and said, hey, look, Pops, we're going to Australia. It's a great trip, and you really want to come? I said, well, I'll try and get out of NBC, and so I did, and I got my wife's mother and father to come in from England, look after the kids, and we made and we went to Australia. And there we played the first rehearsal, and Benny started looking at me funny. He's looking over the clarinet at me. What's going on? And that's the Ray, and everybody got it up to a certain. Everybody, doesn't matter who you were, everybody got it. And I looked at him, and we exchanged a few choice words, and I finished out the tour and never saw him again.
Wow.
But it still doesn't detract. He was the greatest jazz clarinet player, and I never really understood him as a man, but he sure could play.
Yeah. Tell us a little more about working on the Tonight Show band.
Well, it was great experience. There again, as embarrassing moments, there was a. So I got the job, and that's right. Skitch Henderson had been the leader, but then there was some trouble there, and he left. And Doc Severinsen, you know, my good friend and great trumpet player, and I was used to working with him most days in the studios doing something. And he said, well, I'm the band leader now. You know, I'd like you to do the job. So fine. So I show up. And, you know, you rehearse the music as much as you can, just once through, and then you sit there, and the show goes on for an hour and a half, and you play what you have to play. But then they come back after a commercial, and a couple of stagehands come up, take the piano away from me, put it right out in the center of the stage. Then they said, get up. I said, what do you mean? And they take the piano seat and put it out there. I said, out there. So the camera comes back, and it's just on me in the center of the stage. The band's over there, and this big fat comic comes out. He's Leonard. Yeah. Oh, he was very big at the time. It's kind of before Don Rickles. His whole act was to insult people, and it's very funny.
You didn't know this was coming?
No, I didn't know it was coming. I didn't know. It was a hole in the wall. But he comes out there and proceeds to do like 10 minutes on me, and I'm sitting there. And it's my first day on the job.
Baptism by fire.
I'm sitting there, and I'm steaming by this time.
Yeah.
But it all worked out. Everybody had a good laugh. The band was killing themselves laughing. Look at it. But we had like many experiences, and it was great as a pianist. I mean, once a wonderful lady opera singer, Marilyn Horn, came on, and you know, so we had a rehearsal. It was a very fading piece of music, yellowing piece of music, and just like you described, fly crap or something. And so I'm just playing this, and you know, I'll read anything, and I'm playing, but you don't have the feeling. You got to be born to that kind of music, like I'm born to play jazz.
Yeah.
but I'm reading, And we're going on. And so fine, we get to the show, and so again, they put the piano out in the center, and Marilyn comes out, and she's got these wonderful pipes, what a marvelous singer, and we're playing, and Doc is turning pages for me, you know.
Uh-oh.
So Doc is kind of nervous, and he turns over several pages at once, and there I am trying to fake some aria which I have no idea what it's about. I mean, you can't really fake that stuff. You know? I mean, it sounds like free jazz, and this lady's singing harder. But anyway, we finally we somehow we got back on track. But then I noticed after that the lady brought in her own accompanist.
Yeah.
The next time she came in.
Let me ask you, that must have been a blast. Tell me some of the other interesting people that you accompanied when you played on the show.
Well,
Some of the most fun people you backed up.
well, lots of people. It wasn't on that particular show. I'm trying to think of that particular show, but really the funniest story was, it wasn't the Tonight Show, but it was at the same time, and I came home from work, I think it was after Benny, and there was a message from our service. We all belong to this service that it's called, and my wife had left it. They said the registry called, you've got to be at ABC television at 5:30. It's the Good Morning America show. It's, you know, it's a network show. You've got to accompany Pavaratti, and that was the end of the message. So I thought, oh, it was already 1 o'clock, you know. What do I do?
AM.
Yeah,
This is AM.
yeah. And so I thought, well, it's too late now to start getting the opera books out and start practicing. So I just got up early and go into town. At least there's no traffic going to town. I'm all ready there. So I'm there for the 5:30 rehearsal. The show goes on at 7 a.m., you know. And so I'm getting a little antsy. I thought, well, you know, at least we should run down this stuff, you know. And so I'm looking at my watch, 6 o'clock comes, there's no Pavarotti, 6:15, and I'm really starting to get a little nervous. And so 6:45, I was supposed to go on at 7. The door opens, and in comes this great big guy, you know, and this presence, and he goes to the lady producer and starts putting his arms around her, making up the lady producer. Wonderful guy, and I'm running around. So, where's the music? I finally get his attention. It's 5 to 7 now.
Oh.
Finally, I said, I'm the pianist. Which aria are you going to sing? You know, give me a shot. We got to rehearse it. Oh, you see my manager. I said, where's the manager? He says, that little guy in the corner. So I find the little guy in the corner. He's got this briefcase. I said, come on, I'm the pianist for Mr. Pavarotti. Which aria is he going to sing? So the guy opens the thing, and he gives me out this old piece of music. I look at it and says, we wish you a Merry Christmas.
Oh, man.
So I played the hell out of it.
Yeah.
And I list that on my resume,
Yeah.
play with Pavarotti.
Right.
But I mean, all those guys over the years, I mean, played with everybody. Frank Sinatra. Frank was between conductors, and he's had a pianist with him, a guy called Bill Miller, forever. They've been buddies all their lives. Well, he didn't like the conductor, so they elevated Bill Miller to be the conductor. And they said, well, we need a pianist, so get Derek in for this weekend. So I came down to Atlantic City to play, and so Frank is kind of older now, and he takes time in between things. So and I'm kind of nervous, you know. I don't trust the conductor, and I think, who am I going to get my cues from? So, but anyway, the tune comes up, and it's piano arpeggio. So I give him the arpeggio. Frank stops with him. He comes over the piano. He's got a drink in the piano, so he takes a drink, and he starts telling a story to the audience. It's funny, and he's drinking. It's the last show, and so he seems to be stopping. So I give him the arpeggio again. Comes back to the piano, takes another drink. He tells another story, and I'm really getting uptight here. So I give him another arpeggio. And he turns around at me and he deliberately says, "It's okay, kid, you don't have to hit me with a truck." I said, okay, I didn't know where you got it. but in that time, we worked with all these guys. I mean, Placido Domingo, they all came in and you just read the music. And I remember Placido with a big orchestra. And you know, he's got a wonderful set of pipes and marvelous voice. He says, don't like that. Take it up a minor third. I mean, big orchestra, and nobody batted an eye. Everybody went straight into it.
No
And it was a
kidding.
difficult piano part, and I'm saying, whoops.
I mean, the orchestra transposed it itself.
Absolutely. Not a word was said. Nobody complained. Boom, straight into it. Conducted.
Oh, I never heard of that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's not usually a skill that most people have.
That happened to us one time we're at Indiana University.
Hmm.
We were playing a piece, and the conductor said, "It's not exciting enough." Said, "Transpose it up a minor third."
Yeah.
Wow.
And he said, next rehearsal, he said one or two things. If you can do it by ear, do it. If you can't, I want it written out on your own part. He said, but when I call that modulation, it better be there.
Well, you know, it's another skill. I used to get upset if singers would say that. Singers would come in with some sheet and say, I do it in E or G flat, you know, and I used to get real smart and say, well, I don't. But it depended on how much respect you had for them. If it was some singer that you know, you couldn't tell the difference between the G flat and G, I'll go and play it in the key that's
Yeah, right. Okay, it's in your key now, right?
But some of them know, and they get my respect, and I'll work with them.
Yeah. Yeah, working with singers can be very interesting.
Yeah. It's,
You know, they tell this joke. They say, how do you know when there's a singer on your front porch? They said,
because she's lost her key and she
they
doesn't know where to
can't
go.
find the key and don't know when to come in. Can't find the key and don't know when to come in. Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
How do you feel that jazz is a representation of oral culture on the printed page?
If you're really asking me whether jazz is a triumph of education over talent, no, there's no question about it. I think that the finest players are the guys who feel it here, and he comes out, and I'll take a guy that really cannot play the instrument too well, but I recognize the signs of music coming out there, and it's just a question before he can really do it better. I mean, it'd be embarrassing. I could name you names of people I've heard at early stages of development, and people said, nah, I can't play it. I said, listen, can't you hear what he's trying to play? He's hearing it in his head. He just doesn't know enough about the instrument yet to play it properly.
Yeah.
Give him come back in a year or so. I can think of certain guys who are wonderful now. And I don't know whether that really answers your question. That's
Well, you learned mostly from records.
right,
you know,
sure.
and
I started learning from records. Then I think I've learned most of it from playing with guys.
Yeah.
People do things when you're playing, and it changes all your ideas.
Right.
And that's what I love about jazz. And I'm developing a solo act now simply because that's the way it is. But I love that playing with other guys about jazz, because just whatever they feel about a song or whatever you're playing, it makes you play differently. Their input, because you all play off of each other.
Yeah. What about working with Milt Hinton?
Milt's the greatest. You know, I mean, we all love him. He's going to be 85, but we're also worried because when Milt goes, a sizable amount of this music goes. You know, a whole way of playing.
Yeah.
A whole way of playing. Nobody left that does that like that.
Yeah.
And, so we all guard him very diligently.
Yeah.
It's a whole feeling, which you know. It's like the previous question. You can't really write down what that feeling means.
Right.
You just have to be there and be around the man and play and feel the enthusiasm and how he gets from one place to another. And I've tried to analyze it, and I find it very difficult.
You know, there's an authenticity that is at the heart of the best jazz music that I've heard and participated in. And something that alarms me is that in some of today's pop music, I feel like they're playing chords or they're singing lyrics just to sell an album. And I don't feel sometimes that the musicians have really experienced what it is they're saying or playing. You know, and do you see any young artists today that are bringing any of that authenticity back?
Well, that's hard for me to say. I must admit I've been as guilty as others of my age, that I've really turned away from that music because I don't find anything that reflects my my ideas. But, you know, my children respect me for what I do, but they've got their own kind of music, and it's today's music. I can't really answer your question. There are young players who play jazz. I mean, I see them all the time. But I think their roots are in the music that we've played, and so they're carrying on and developing that tradition. Some of the newer music I find difficult to listen to. When it comes to pop music, I've often gone into this argument and say, well, pop music now is so terrible, but pop music has always been exactly that. It's been the popular music of the age. I don't think jazz was ever really the popular music of the age. It was always a minority interest, and so we get together and have these discussions about it and put down rap music. But there was so much in the 20s and 30s of Moon and June and Spoon, really dumb things, and we just accepted it because we were young then. But it's no better or worse or any different. It's just the popular music of the time. I don't think jazz was ever the popular music of the time. Maybe swing in the 40s, I suppose, but
that was more of a dance.
Yeah,
there wasn't
it was
nearly
dance
as much
craze.
improvisation involved.
Right.
It was more arranged and
exactly.
Have you had occasion to perform with Joe Williams?
Well, on the same stage, I haven't, because he's usually had Norman Simmons playing for him. Even if I'm the studio pianist in the orchestra, they say, oh no, come on, he's got his own piano player. But I've known Joe all these years and always been a fan of his.
yeah.
How do you feel his voice typifies jazz vocals?
Well, he sounds to me like a good tenor player playing. It's something in the timbre of his voice. I don't know how to describe that either, but something in the timbre. There's an art to singing or playing a melody, so that it becomes not just acceptable but brilliant. And Joe's got that effortlessly. And so he's not playing hot like Frank West is playing hot. But you know what? If you hear Frank play the melody, and it's beautiful. And Joe is playing around the melody, and it's
heard
beautiful.
that last night.
Yeah,
actually,
sure.
one of his ballads.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Joe's got it.
You have any quick words about what it's like to play in other countries and how they accept our?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I've been to Japan a fair amount, and they're so serious about the music. I guess that's the Japanese. It's a very authoritarian country, a very patriarchal society. I don't know whether that explains it or not, but I remember playing. I was over there with a bunch of guys led by Benny Carter. This was in 1985, and we were sitting around like this after a concert, and a guy comes in with a shopping bag, and he doesn't go to all these other guys who are much better known than I was. He comes to me, he says in halting English, "I have every record you ever made." I said, "What?" And he proceeded to put them out on the table like that. He just wanted me to sign them. And I was so flattered. He got records there that I didn't know were out, on the market. And some I'd certainly never been paid for. And this man had got everything. And he knew dates and who was on everything. I'm just using this to demonstrate how much they're into the music and the musicians. I guess you call them musicographers, perhaps more than players. There are a few good Japanese players, but they're so interested in jazz as a subject. And if you go to Europe, it always upsets me because you can go to this place that they call it the Zoo, but it's the North Sea Festival, and it's in The Hague, and it's the biggest one that I know. You can go into this huge building, and there are 12 stages going constantly for about 10 hours a day, maybe more than that, with all different attractions, and it's mobbed. Just that's what upsets me. I seldom go to a festival in this country where there are that many people running around. Mm-hmm. Naturally, on this ship, it's full of older people who like kind of older mainstream music. But if you go to Europe, you go to Japan, huge crowds of younger people interested in jazz. I think that's about it.
Yeah, okay. Well, you have any last words for our,
Yeah, I wanted
our
to
budding
ask,
jazz people at school, or Mike, you have something else?
yeah, I wanted to just ask you if you could give a word to young people, college-age people that you know are going to see this interview in years to come. If you could give them just a piece of advice about listening to, participating in, or appreciating this music. Any hints, any insights that would help them get handles on it quickly and easily?
Well, of course, it's different to when I was a kid. There weren't all these music programs at colleges, for one thing. And where I grew up, there was 2 colleges, Oxford and Cambridge, and you had to be brilliant to get into there. And they certainly didn't have a jazz program. But now you can go to college. Almost any major college now has got a jazz program. I'm sure they vary. Some are better than others. But there are some that are really very good. And so a kid with talent, if they can possibly afford to get there, or a scholarship or something, should go to one of these and soak up as much information as they can. But like we were talking about before, it's not really the information, it's the talent and managing to bring it out. Now, my own experience has been you can only do that by playing with players. I've always tried and made it a point, always try and play with people who are better than you, because that's the way you're going to learn. And not just playing, but hanging around, talking to them. There's so much to talk about, especially the older players. If you've got somebody like Milt to talk to, I mean, Milt's the greatest guy in an airplane on a long plane ride, because he's got so many stories. Some are funny, some are cogent, some are that's great for young people to hear. I don't think there are any shortcuts. You've got to keep playing your instrument, keep learning. I always tell them, for business reasons, learn to write, learn to sing, learn all the angles of the business, which I didn't learn until I was much older. Learn about publishing.
Yeah.
Publishers make all the money in this business.
Right.
Sometimes the artist is the last one to see his money, am I right?
Absolutely. We create it, but it's a business, and learn that it's a business. I think kids know that today. They're much hipper about it, but I kind of regret that it was. I was much older before I found out things like that. I wasn't interested. I just wanted to play. I wanted to play, and I can't play this thing that I hear in my head. I've got to keep playing. But I don't think there are any shortcuts. I think I don't know whether that was Clark Terry's words, but he said first you imitate,
Yeah.
and then you assimilate, and lastly, then you. It's wonderful, really, and I don't find any shortcuts. Just keep playing and try and play with people that are better than you all the time.
All right. We want to thank Derek Smith for joining us on this wonderful cruise, and say goodbye now for the Hamilton Jazz Archives.